Marcus Reed was only 20 years old, yet the city had already judged him. Young, black, wealthy, and therefore suspicious. He walked through downtown Chicago in designer clothes, but doors opened slower for him, smiles faded faster, and respect always came with conditions. Still, Marcus spent his days helping strangers, feeding homeless white veterans, paying for groceries, offering kindness to people who often returned it with silence or contempt. He believed one simple truth. No one chooses their skin color, but everyone chooses their conscience. Then, one afternoon, he saw a 15-year-old black girl forced to kneel on the pavement, her swollen hand crushed beneath a man's shoe. In that moment, Marcus learned something painful. Silence protects cruelty. He stepped in, knowing it would cost him everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Chicago, in late winter, felt like a city made of glass and judgment. A thin gray sky pressed low over the skyline, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan cut between the buildings like a blade. People hurried with shoulders raised, collars up, eyes forward, moving fast, not just to escape the cold, but to avoid noticing anyone who didn't belong. Marcus Reed had learned what not belonging looked like, even when you had everything. He was 20 years old, young enough that strangers still called him kid, but old enough to carry himself like he'd already survived a lifetime of quiet battles. Marcus was tall, a little over 6 feet, with a lean, athletic build that came from discipline more than vanity. His skin was a deep brown that looked almost luminous against the pale winter light. He wore his hair short and neat, a clean lineup and soft curls on top, always groomed but never flashy. His face had strong cheekbones and a calm, focused gaze, dark eyes that didn't flinch even when the world tried to make him smaller. In public, Marcus's expression was usually controlled, quiet, unreadable. Not because he lacked emotion, but because he'd learned that people loved to misinterpret a black man's feelings. Too warm, and they called it suspicious. Too firm, and they called it threatening. So Marcus chose composure. He chose restraint. He chose to speak with actions more than words. He also chose something else: generosity. Marcus could have lived like a ghost in a penthouse, protected by glass and distance. He had money, real money, the kind that bought silence, comfort, and a life without consequences. He owned a matte black luxury car with a custom interior, the kind of car that turned heads at red lights. His watches were understated but expensive. His clothes were tailored, clean, and sharp, never loud brands, never gaudy. Wealth worn like confidence rather than costume. But every morning, Marcus did the opposite of what the city expected from him. Instead of a private gym, he went outside. Instead of an exclusive cafe, he walked the streets. Instead of guarding his money, he gave it away in small, quiet ways. It started 2 years ago, after a night he still didn't like to talk about. Marcus had grown up in a neighborhood where sirens were as common as birds. His mother had worked double shifts at a nursing home, coming home with tired eyes and sore hands, still managing to smile when he brought home a good grade. She died when he was 16, an unexpected complication after a routine surgery. Marcus never fully recovered from that loss. The grief didn't make him bitter, but it made him purposeful. It carved something into him, a refusal to let people be invisible the way his mother had been invisible to the system that overworked her. The money came later, through an app he built, a clean piece of technology that solved a real problem for small businesses. Investors arrived quickly. The world applauded him loudly, then almost immediately began to question if he deserved it. Marcus was praised in headlines and doubted in hallways. On this particular morning, he stepped out of a modern apartment building with a doorman who greeted him politely but didn't meet his eyes. Marcus wore a charcoal wool coat over a dark sweater, fitted pants, and leather boots polished enough to reflect the sidewalk lights. The wind lifted the edge of his coat as he walked, but his pace stayed steady. He stopped at a corner bakery that smelled like warm bread and cinnamon. Behind the counter stood a woman named Angela Moreno, a Latina in her late 30s with warm brown skin, thick dark hair pulled into a messy bun, and a face shaped by kindness and exhaustion. Angela was short and curvy, always moving fast, always managing 3 things at once. She had the kind of friendly voice that made regular customers feel remembered. "Morning, Marcus," she said, already reaching for a paper bag. "Same as usual?" Marcus nodded. 2 turkey sandwiches. Extra napkins. Angela's eyes softened the way they always did when Marcus ordered more than he needed. She never made it a big deal, never asked questions that would embarrass him or the people he helped. She just rang him up and slid the bag across the counter. "You're out early," she said. "Always," Marcus replied. He offered a small smile, brief, polite. "It's colder today." Angela snorted. "Chicago doesn't care about our feelings. Stay warm." Outside, Marcus tucked the bag under his arm and headed toward a stretch of streets where the shiny downtown began to fray into something rougher. Alleys, underpasses, old brick walls tagged with paint. He walked past a row of high-end boutiques where the window mannequins wore coats that cost more than some people made in a month. The security guard at one of the stores watched Marcus longer than necessary. Marcus didn't look back. He'd felt that kind of gaze his whole life. Not fear exactly, more like suspicion dressed up as caution. Even now, with his bank account and his polished shoes, he still had to prove he belonged in places that welcomed others without question. A few blocks later, near a subway entrance, Marcus spotted Frank Delaney. Frank was an older white man, late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a narrow face and a gray beard that grew in uneven patches. He was tall once, Marcus guessed, but years of sleeping on hard ground had curved his posture forward. Frank's hands were rough and cracked, his nails rimmed with grime that never fully came off. He wore a threadbare army green jacket and 2 mismatched gloves. His eyes were pale blue, alert and guarded, like someone who had learned not to trust help, because help often came with strings. At Frank's feet lay a dog. The dog's name was Milo, a medium-sized mixed breed with sandy fur and a white patch on his chest. Milo looked about 7 or 8 years old, with a graying muzzle and eyes the color of dark honey. One ear flopped while the other stood halfway up, giving him a permanently curious expression. His tail wagged softly when Marcus approached, but he stayed close to Frank, loyal and cautious. Marcus crouched slightly, careful not to startle them. "Morning, Frank," Marcus said. Frank looked up, squinting. His expression was defensive at first, then it loosened by a fraction when recognition landed. "You again." Marcus didn't take offense. Frank rarely said thank you. That was part of the deal. Help without conditions. "I brought food," Marcus said, holding out the bag, "and something for Milo." At the word Milo, the dog's tail tapped the ground, a quiet rhythm. Frank hesitated, eyes flicking between Marcus's face and his hands as if checking for a trick. "Why you keep doing this?" he asked, voice rough. "Ain't your job." Marcus stood, steady and calm. "Maybe it should be someone's job," he said. "But until it is, I can." Frank stared at him, and for a second Marcus saw something behind the older man's suspicion. Shame, maybe, or confusion, or the discomfort people felt when someone they'd been taught to fear showed them kindness. Frank took the bag, slowly. "You're wasting your time on me," he muttered. Marcus shrugged. "I've wasted time on worse things." Milo leaned forward and sniffed Marcus's hand. Marcus let him, palm open, still. The dog's nose was cold and wet, and his breath puffed visibly in the air. "Take care of that hand," Marcus said, nodding toward Frank's knuckles, which were red and cracked from the cold. Frank flexed his fingers like he'd forgotten pain was visible. "It'll heal." Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tube of ointment and a pair of thick socks, still folded. Frank's eyes narrowed. "I don't want charity." Marcus's voice stayed gentle. "Then don't call it charity." He held the items out anyway. "Call it someone noticing." For a moment, Frank didn't move. Then, quietly, he took them. Marcus didn't linger. That was another rule he'd learned. Don't hover around people's dignity like it belongs to you. Help, then step back. As Marcus walked away, he felt the familiar weight of eyes again. A couple passing by glanced at him, then at Frank, then back at Marcus like they couldn't fit the picture into their minds. A well-dressed black man giving food to a homeless white veteran didn't match the story they carried inside their heads. Marcus kept walking. His next stop was a small pharmacy tucked beside a coffee shop. He stepped inside, warmth washing over him, and immediately felt the shift, the subtle stiffening of the clerk behind the counter, the way another customer's purse strap tightened, the way a security camera seemed to become a little more present. Marcus didn't make a scene. He never did. At the back of the store, an elderly man sat on a bench near the blood pressure machine staring at a paper bag in his hands like it contained a problem too heavy to carry. His name was Walter Briggs. Walter was a white man in his early 70s, short and thin, with pale skin spotted by age and a head of wispy white hair. His shoulders slumped as if life had been pressing down on him for years. His face was lined deep around the mouth, lines shaped by worry more than laughter. He wore a brown coat that looked clean but old, and his shoes were scuffed at the toes. Walter's eyes were watery and tired, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and still kept showing up. Marcus recognized him from weeks ago. Walter had once stared at Marcus with open suspicion, like Marcus might steal something simply by standing too close. But today, Walter looked less suspicious and more defeated. Marcus approached slowly. "Mr. Briggs?" Walter's head lifted. His eyes blinked, searching Marcus's face. "You," he said, as if surprised Marcus existed in the same world as him. Marcus nodded. "You said last time your prescription was expensive." Walter's jaw tightened. "It's not your problem." Marcus knelt slightly, lowering himself to Walter's level, not towering. "It's a heart medication," Marcus said softly, nodding toward the bag. "How long have you been stretching it?" Walter didn't answer. That silence was an answer. Marcus exhaled through his nose, calm. "Let me help." Walter's hands trembled. "I don't want to owe you." Marcus shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But you owe yourself a chance to stay alive." Walter swallowed hard. His eyes flicked away, ashamed. "I worked 40 years, he whispered. 40 years and I'm still here, counting pennies like a kid." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't pity Walter. He understood him. The system was cruel in a way that didn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looked like paperwork, price tags, and silent suffering. Marcus stood and walked to the counter. The clerk, a young white man with a buzz cut and a tight smile, watched Marcus with the same cautious stare Marcus had seen in too many places. "I'd like to pay for Walter Briggs's prescription," Marcus said. The clerk raised his eyebrows. "You know him?" Marcus met his eyes. "I do." The clerk hesitated as if deciding whether to question more, then rang it up. Marcus paid without flinching. The receipt printed like a long sigh. When Marcus returned to Walter, he handed him the bag. Walter stared at it like it might vanish. "I can't," Walter said, voice cracked. "People don't just do that." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice softened. "They can," he said. "They just don't often enough." Walter looked up, and for the first time, his suspicion broke completely. His eyes filled with tears he tried to blink away. "I'm sorry," Walter whispered, "for how I looked at you before." Marcus didn't force forgiveness, didn't dramatize it. He simply nodded once. "Thank you for saying it." That was another thing Marcus believed. People could change, but only if someone gave them a safe place to admit they were wrong. Marcus stepped back into the street. The wind hit his face again, sharp and cold. The city roared around him, traffic, footsteps, distant sirens. Above the noise, Marcus could still feel the quiet truth he carried. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy acceptance. Not yet. As he walked past a high-end restaurant, a host in a black suit glanced at Marcus and then looked away, pretending not to see him. A couple in expensive coats entered and were greeted instantly with warm smiles. Marcus stood outside the restaurant for half a second. Not because he wanted to go in, but because he wanted to measure something inside himself. Did it still hurt? Yes. But it didn't stop him. Because Marcus wasn't trying to win approval. He was trying to win something harder. Humanity. He pulled his coat tighter and kept walking, disappearing into the winter crowd like a quiet challenge the city refused to answer. And somewhere in that gray afternoon, without Marcus knowing it yet, the ordinary day was already moving toward the moment that would test everything he believed. The afternoon light was already fading when Marcus turned off the main street and into a narrow road near the old commercial district. The air smelled different here, less polished, more metallic, like rust and wet concrete. The buildings were shorter, older, their windows clouded with dust and forgotten signs. A cold wind funneled through the alleyway, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong to the usual rhythm of the city. A soft, broken plea. "Please, stop! It hurts!" Marcus slowed, then stopped completely. The voice was young. Too young to sound that afraid. He followed the sound a few steps farther until the scene opened in front of him, framed by a closed pawn shop and a shuttered shoe repair store that hadn't seen customers in years. What he saw made his chest tighten in a way he recognized. An instinctive warning, the kind that came before a line was crossed. A white man stood in the center of the sidewalk, his posture relaxed, almost bored, as if he were waiting for a coffee order. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, tall and solidly built, with broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his tailored coat. His hair was dark blonde, slicked neatly back, and his face was clean-shaven except for faint smile lines that suggested he was used to being pleased with himself. His shoes were expensive, polished leather, the kind that reflected light even in dim places. Beneath him, kneeling on the cold pavement, was a black girl who couldn't have been more than 15. Her name, Marcus would later learn, was Lena Carter. Lena was small for her age, thin in a way that spoke of missed meals rather than youth. Her dark skin contrasted sharply with the gray sidewalk, and her hair was pulled into two uneven braids that had begun to fray at the ends. She wore a worn hoodie several sizes too big and jeans faded at the knees. Her sneakers were old, the soles thinning, the laces mismatched. Her face was young, round cheeks, wide brown eyes, but her expression held a fear no child should carry. She was holding one shoe in her trembling hands, trying desperately to clean it with the edge of her shirt. "Lau ki vao," the man snapped, his voice sharp and impatient. "You missed a spot." Lena's hands shook harder as she obeyed. She pressed the fabric against the leather, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Her eyes flicked up once, just once, toward the people passing by. Then they dropped again. Marcus looked around. People were walking past. A woman with shopping bags glanced over, frowned, then kept moving. A man in a business coat slowed for half a second, took in the scene, and turned away. A pair of teenagers whispered to each other and crossed the street. No one stopped. No one said anything. The white man shifted his weight and then, without warning, brought his foot down hard on Lena's hand, pinning it to the pavement. The sound was dull, sickening, a mix of flesh and concrete. Lena cried out a sharp, involuntary scream that cut through the air. Please, she sobbed. Please, I'm sorry. Quiet, the man said, his tone irritated rather than angry, like she was an inconvenience. You're making a scene. Marcus felt heat rise behind his eyes. He had seen injustice before. Plenty of it. He had watched security guards follow him through stores. He had felt the pause in people's voices when he spoke too confidently. He had endured the subtle cruelty of lowered expectations and silent assumptions. But this was different. This was not subtle. This was not quiet. This was cruelty made public and tolerated. Marcus stood still for a few seconds longer, his mind racing through the consequences the way it always did. Call the police? How long would they take? Would they believe the girl? Would they believe him? Shout? That might only escalate things, might make the man angry enough to hurt her more. Lena whimpered again, her free hand clawing weakly at the ground. That was the moment Marcus knew there was no version of this where walking away was acceptable. He stepped forward. The sound of his shoes against the pavement drew the man's attention. The man turned, irritation flashing across his face when he saw Marcus approaching. His eyes moved quickly, from Marcus's face to his clothes to his posture, assessing, judging. "What do you want?" the man asked. His voice carried the confidence of someone used to not being challenged. Marcus stopped a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. His hands remained open at his sides. "Let her go," Marcus said. The man laughed. A short, humorless sound. "This is none of your business." Marcus's gaze dropped briefly to Lena's hand, still trapped beneath the shoe. The skin around it was already swelling, flushed red and angry. "It became my business when you hurt her," Marcus replied. The man's expression hardened. "You people always think you can tell others what to do," he said. "She works for tips. She did a bad job. I'm teaching her a lesson." Lena shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. I tried." "Shut up!" the man snapped, pressing his foot down harder. Lena screamed again. Marcus moved. It wasn't a wild reaction. It wasn't rage. It was controlled, precise, driven by something colder and more dangerous than anger, certainty. Marcus reached out and shoved the man squarely in the chest. The force caught the man off guard. He stumbled backward, his foot lifting off Lena's hand as he lost balance. He fell hard, crashing into a stack of empty crates behind him. One crate snapped under his weight. The man hit the ground with a sharp grunt, his head striking the pavement as his face scraped against the concrete. The street went silent. Lena pulled her hand back instantly, clutching it to her chest. She rocked forward and back, crying softly, her breath hitching. Marcus turned toward her immediately, dropping to one knee. "Hey," he said quietly. "You're okay. He's not touching you anymore." Her eyes were wide with shock. She nodded weakly, still shaking. Behind them, the man groaned and sat up slowly. There was a small cut along his cheekbone already darkening, and his lip was split. He touched his face and stared at the blood on his fingers in disbelief. "You assaulted me," he said, his voice rising. "You attacked me." Marcus stood and faced him. "I stopped you." "You think that matters?" the man snapped. He scrambled to his feet, fury replacing surprise. "You just ruined your life." "Ours," sirens wailed in the distance. Not close yet, but close enough to promise consequences. People who had been ignoring the scene moments ago were suddenly watching intently. Phones raised, whispers spreading like sparks. Lena looked up at Marcus, fear flooding her face again. "I don't want trouble," she whispered. "Please." Marcus met her eyes. In that moment, he made a choice he knew would follow him long after this day. "I've got you," he said simply. The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers stepped out, one young, one older, hands resting near their belts. Their eyes took in the scene quickly. The injured white man, the black man standing tall, the black girl clutching her hand. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest as the older officer's gaze lingered on him. "What happened here?" the officer asked. The white man spoke first. "He attacked me," he said, pointing at Marcus, "out of nowhere." Lena opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her shoulders curled inward, her body instinctively trying to disappear. Marcus looked down at her, then back at the officers. "I pushed him," Marcus said calmly, "because he was hurting her." The younger officer glanced at Lena's hand, now visibly swollen. His jaw tightened slightly. The older officer sighed. "Everyone's coming with us," he said. "We'll sort it out at the station." As they were led away, Marcus felt the weight of the stares around him. Some were curious. Some were judgmental. A few looked almost relieved that someone had finally acted, though none of those people had moved until he did. Lena walked beside Marcus, her steps small and uncertain. She didn't look at him, but she stayed close, as if his presence were the only thing keeping her upright. The sun dipped below the buildings, casting long shadows across the street. And with that, the ordinary day Marcus had been walking through quietly crossed into something irreversible. The police station smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down and thicken. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glare on the gray walls. Marcus sat upright on a metal bench, his hands resting calmly on his knees. His coat had been taken, his watch removed, but his posture hadn't changed. He looked exactly like someone who knew where he stood, even if the ground beneath him was shifting. Across the room, Lena sat on a plastic chair, her injured hand wrapped in temporary gauze. She was smaller here, dwarfed by the institutional space, her feet barely touching the floor. She kept her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed downward as if looking up might invite trouble. Every few seconds she glanced toward Marcus, not openly but quickly, like she was checking whether he was still there. Marcus noticed every glance. An officer entered the room, carrying a clipboard. His name tag read, Officer Daniel Brooks. Brooks was in his early 30s, average height with a stocky build shaped by years on patrol rather than the gym. His skin was pale, his hair cropped short, and his eyes carried a fatigue that suggested he'd seen too many versions of this night already. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't gentle either. He had learned to protect himself with emotional distance. "Marcus Reed," Brooks said, reading from the paper. "You understand why you're here?" Marcus met his gaze. "Yes?" Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Care to explain why you assaulted a civilian?" Marcus didn't rush to answer. "I intervened," he said evenly, "because a child was being harmed." Brooks exhaled through his nose and made a note. "The man claims you attacked him without provocation." Marcus nodded once. He would. Brooks paused, studying Marcus's face like he was searching for something. Anger, guilt, fear. He found none of it. "We'll get to her statement," Brooks said, nodding toward Lena. "But you should know he's already requested medical documentation. Minor facial injuries, bruising, scratches." Marcus didn't look surprised. "I pushed him." "That's assault," Brooks said, not unkindly, just factual. Marcus held his gaze. "So is what he did to her." Brooks didn't argue. He simply closed the folder. "Sit tight." Across the station, the man Marcus had pushed was being tended to by a paramedic. His name was Thomas Hale. Hale was in his late 40s, well-groomed, with the kind of expensive coat that didn't wrinkle easily. Even now, with a split lip and a reddening bruise along his cheekbone, he carried himself like someone accustomed to control. He spoke loudly, ensuring anyone nearby could hear his version of events. "That thug attacked me," Hale said, gesturing animatedly. "I didn't touch the girl. She was working. He lost his temper." The paramedic, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, cleaned his cut without responding. She'd learned long ago that silence was sometimes the safest reply. Marcus watched from a distance. He felt no satisfaction, no relief, only a quiet, heavy certainty settling in his chest. Lena was called in next. She stood slowly, clutching her injured hand to her chest. Officer Brooks led her into a smaller room, closing the door gently behind them. Marcus was left alone with his thoughts, the hum of the lights and the distant murmur of voices. He thought about his mother. She had taught him that doing the right thing didn't guarantee protection. "Good choices don't make you invisible," she used to say. "Sometimes they make you a target." Marcus had nodded back then, too young to fully understand. Now, sitting on a metal bench in a police station, he felt the truth of her words settle into him. Minutes stretched into an hour. When Lena returned, her eyes were red, but her posture was different. Straighter, stronger. She sat beside Marcus this time, close enough that their sleeves brushed. She didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. Officer Brooks returned with another officer, Sergeant Elaine Turner. Turner was a black woman in her early 40s, tall and solidly built, with close-cropped hair and a commanding presence that filled the room without effort. Her uniform was crisp, her badge worn smooth from years of use. Her eyes were sharp, observant, but not unkind. She had built her career by being precise, by refusing to be careless in a system that often was. She looked at Marcus for a long moment before speaking. "You understand this won't be simple," Turner said. Marcus nodded. "I didn't expect it to be." Turner glanced at Lena's bandaged hand. "The girl's statement aligns with yours." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't relax. He had learned not to celebrate too early. "But," Turner continued, "the other party is pressing charges, claims excessive force." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Then I'll answer for my actions." Turner studied him again, this time with something like respect flickering briefly across her face. "Most people don't say that." Marcus shrugged slightly. "I'm not most people." The paperwork was processed quickly after that. Marcus signed forms, read statements, acknowledged charges. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call anyone at all. Not because he couldn't, but because he wanted to face this without hiding behind influence. When they finally stepped back out into the night, the air felt colder than before. Lina was released into temporary protective custody. A social worker, a slim white woman named Rachel Moore, early 30s, soft-spoken and cautious, knelt to Lena's level, speaking gently, promising safety and help. Rachel's eyes flicked toward Marcus once, full of questions she didn't ask. Lena turned to Marcus before leaving. "They're going to punish you," she whispered. Marcus met her gaze. "Maybe." Her lower lip trembled. "You didn't have to do that." Marcus shook his head. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." She stared at him for a long second, then nodded. She lifted her injured hand slightly, not in a wave, but in acknowledgement. Then she followed the social worker into a waiting car. Marcus remained on the steps of the station as the doors closed behind him. Across the street, Thomas Hale was already on his phone, his voice sharp, confident. "Get me a lawyer," he said. "Yes, tonight." Marcus watched without expression. He knew what came next. Charges, court dates, headlines that would tell only part of the story. People who would say he should have walked away, others who would say he deserved what was coming. Money could make things easier. But Marcus had made a choice the moment he stepped forward in that alley. He had chosen to be seen. And once seen, there was no going back. He pulled his coat tighter and walked into the night, fully aware that justice, once challenged, always demanded a price. The courtroom was colder than Marcus expected, not from temperature but from stillness. The kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every movement sound louder than it should. Wooden benches stretched in long, orderly rows, polished to a dull shine by decades of waiting bodies. The city seal hung behind the judge's bench, heavy and official, as if reminding everyone that truth here would have rules. Marcus stood at the defense table, shoulders squared, hands resting calmly in front of him. He wore a simple dark suit, well-fitted but deliberately understated. No luxury watch, no visible signs of wealth. He had chosen restraint again, knowing that excess would distract from what mattered. His face was composed, but beneath the calm lived a quiet tension, like a tightly coiled wire. Beside him stood Lena. Her bandaged hand was still wrapped in white gauze, clean but unmistakable. She wore a borrowed dress that hung slightly loose on her thin frame, navy blue and modest. Her hair had been brushed and tied back neatly, though a few strands escaped around her face. Lena looked smaller here than she had on the street, but there was a new steadiness in her posture. She stood straight, feet planted, eyes forward. Fear was still there, but it no longer owned her completely. Behind them, whispers traveled like wind through dry grass. The prosecutor cleared his throat. His name was Nathan Cole, a white man in his early 40s with a tall, rigid frame and sharply combed dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. His suit was immaculate, his tie knotted perfectly. Cole had built his reputation on precision and appearances. He spoke clearly, confidently, and rarely deviated from the script. To him, cases were puzzles, not people. "Mr. Reed," Cole began, pacing slowly, "you admit that you pushed Mr. Thomas Hale, resulting in bodily injury. Is that correct?" Marcus lifted his chin slightly. "Yes." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Some faces registered surprise, others satisfaction. Cole paused as if allowing the admission to settle. "So you agree that you used violence?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I do." The judge leaned forward. Judge Eleanor Whitman was a woman in her late 60s, tall even while seated, with silver-gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her face bore deep lines carved by years of restraint rather than cruelty. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, but not unfeeling. She had spent her career believing in the structure of the law, even when it failed to protect everyone equally. "And you understand," Judge Whitman said, "that this court does not condone vigilantism." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied. The prosecutor nodded slightly as if the case were already closing in his favor. "Then why," Cole asked, "did you not simply walk away?" Marcus's eyes flicked briefly to Lena's bandaged hand. Then he looked directly at the judge. "Because walking away would have meant agreeing with what was happening," Marcus said. A murmur spread again, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Cole raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting," he said, "that the law failed in that moment?" Marcus took a slow breath. "I'm saying that silence would have failed her." Cole turned toward the jury, spreading his hands. "This court is not a stage for speeches. We deal in facts." Marcus nodded once. "Then let's deal in all of them." Judge Whitman held up a hand, studying Marcus closely. "You may speak." Marcus straightened. He could feel every eye on him now, some skeptical, some curious, some hostile. Lena shifted slightly beside him, and without looking, Marcus adjusted his stance so his shoulder was just a little closer to hers. "I did use force," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying. "And I accept responsibility for that. But force was not the beginning of that day. What began was a man using power to humiliate a child. Because he could. Because he believed no one would stop him." Cole scoffed quietly. "Belief is not evidence." Marcus turned his head slowly and pointed, not wildly, not aggressively, but clearly, at Thomas Hale, seated at the plaintiff's table. "The evidence," Marcus said, "is that he stood while she knelt. He wore polished shoes while she bled on concrete, and dozens of people saw it and chose not to act." Lena's breath caught. Marcus's voice wavered, not from fear, but from restraint. Black people are not born guilty," he continued. "No one is born choosing their skin. If I am punished for stopping him, I will accept it. But this courtroom, this city, this society, has to ask itself how many times it stayed silent before someone finally stepped in." The courtroom went completely still. Judge Whitman froze, her pen hovering above her notes. She had heard arguments before, passionate ones, angry ones. But this was different. Marcus wasn't pleading. He wasn't deflecting. He was holding up a mirror. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Cole cleared his throat again, more sharply this time. "Your Honor, this is an emotional appeal designed to distract—" Judge Whitman raised her hand. "Enough." She turned her gaze to Lena. "Young lady, do you understand where you are?" Lena swallowed. Her voice was small, but clear. "Yes, ma'am." "Did Mr. Reed instruct you to say anything today?" "No," Lena replied. "He told me to tell the truth." The judge nodded slowly. From the back of the courtroom, a woman stood unexpectedly. Sarah Donnelly, a white woman in her mid-30s, average height with a slim build and tired eyes, clutched her purse tightly. She wore a plain gray coat and had the posture of someone unused to speaking publicly. Her hands shook as she raised them slightly. "I saw it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "What happened to the girl?" Gasps rippled through the room. Sarah's hair was pulled into a low ponytail, strands falling loose around her pale face. She looked like someone who had spent years avoiding attention. "I didn't stop," she admitted, tears forming. "I should have, but I saw it." The bailiff moved toward her, but Judge Whitman held him back. "Sit down, ma'am," the judge said gently. "Your statement will be noted." Sarah sank back into her seat, covering her mouth with her hand, shoulders shaking. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Judge Whitman leaned back, her expression no longer neutral. "This court will recess for deliberation," she said. As the gavel struck, the silence shattered into noise, voices rising, chairs scraping, reporters scribbling notes. Lena exhaled shakily, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she reached for Marcus's sleeve. He didn't look down, but he stayed still, allowing the contact. When the judge returned, the room quieted instantly. Judge Whitman's voice was firm. "This court recognizes that Mr. Reed used physical force. However, the court also recognizes the circumstances under which that force was used." She paused. "Mr. Reed will receive a formal warning for his actions, but no criminal conviction. Mr. Hale's conduct will be referred for further investigation regarding abuse and coercion." A sharp intake of breath filled the room. Lena's knees nearly buckled. Marcus reached out instinctively, steadying her. Judge Whitman looked directly at Marcus. "This court does not often hear truths spoken this plainly. You may go." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded. And as they walked out of the courtroom together, the silence behind them felt different. Not heavy, but changed. The courtroom reconvened under a different weight. Not louder, not softer, sharper. The kind of tension that comes when people sense a turning tide, but don't yet know who it will carry and who it will drown. Marcus stood again at the defense table, posture unchanged, eyes steady. Lena sat just behind him now, her bandaged hand resting in her lap. She no longer stared at the floor. She watched. She listened. Marcus's attorney rose. Caleb Morris was a black man in his late 30s, tall and slim, with a neatly trimmed beard and glasses that softened the intensity of his gaze. He wore a navy suit that had seen better days, not flashy, not careless. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried. Caleb had grown up in courtrooms, not as a lawyer at first, but as a kid watching his father navigate a system that rarely bent. That history lived in his posture, in the way he chose his words carefully and then let them land without apology. Your Honor, Caleb said, the defense submits additional evidence. A screen flickered to life. Grainy footage filled the courtroom. Security camera video from a convenience store across the street from the alley. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. The image showed Thomas Hale standing. It showed Lena kneeling. It showed a shoe pressing down on a small hand. It showed her flinch. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper, more like recognition. Caleb let the video play longer than necessary. He wanted no confusion about sequence, no room for reinterpretation. When it ended, he turned slowly toward the jury. This footage, he said, was retrieved legally, time-stamped, and verified by the store owner. It shows the events leading up to Mr. Reed's intervention. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. Caleb continued. The defense also calls a witness. The doors at the side of the courtroom opened. Frank Delaney walked in. He looked smaller than Marcus remembered, older, thinner, shoulders hunched against the invisible weight of the room. Frank wore a donated jacket that fit a little too big and pants with a sharp crease that hadn't been there before. His gray beard was trimmed, his hands scrubbed clean but still rough. His pale blue eyes scanned the courtroom nervously. At his side padded Milo, his mixed-breed dog. Milo's sandy fur had been brushed, his white chest patch bright against the dark floor. He walked calmly, tail low but wagging faintly, eyes alert. He was allowed in as a service animal, though everyone knew he was more than that. He was Frank's anchor. Frank paused at the witness stand. He looked out over the room, swallowing hard. When his eyes found Marcus, something steadied in him. Caleb spoke gently. Mr. Delaney, how do you know the defendant? Frank cleared his throat. He's helped me, more times than I can count. The prosecutor stood. Objection. Relevance. Caleb didn't look away. Establishing credibility. Judge Whitman nodded. Overruled. Frank shifted his weight. He brings food, socks, medicine sometimes. Never asked for anything back, never took pictures, just helped. Caleb nodded. Were you present on the afternoon of the incident? Yes, Frank said. His voice shook, but he didn't stop. I was across the street, saw the whole thing. The courtroom leaned in. Frank described what he saw. Carefully, slowly, he spoke of the man's tone, of the way people passed without stopping, of the moment Lena cried out. He spoke of Marcus stepping in. He spoke of the push. No one else moved, Frank said, eyes shining. Not until him. The prosecutor crossed. His voice was sharper now. Mr. Delaney, you have no permanent address, correct? Frank nodded. That's right. You rely on the defendant's charity? Frank's jaw tightened. I rely on his kindness. There's a difference. A murmur of approval rippled before the gavel fell. The prosecutor pressed. So you're biased. Frank met his gaze. If telling the truth is bias, then yes. Silence followed, the kind that refused to be filled. Caleb rested his hands on the podium. No further questions. Thomas Hale sat rigid, his face pale. The confident tilt of his chin from earlier days was gone. His eyes flicked to the jury, then away. He avoided Lena entirely. The judge called a brief recess. In the hallway, Lena sat beside Marcus on a wooden bench. Her shoulders trembled once, then stilled. She stared at her wrapped hand, as if seeing it for the first time. I didn't think anyone would say anything, she whispered. Marcus didn't answer right away. He placed his hand gently over the back of the bench, close enough for comfort without pressure. Sometimes people need permission to remember who they are. A social worker approached. Janine Brooks, a black woman in her mid-40s with a warm face and steady eyes. She wore a sensible cardigan and carried a folder tucked against her chest. Her voice was calm, practiced. "I'll be with you after," she told Lena softly. "We've arranged temporary placement, school support, medical care." Lena nodded, overwhelmed. When the courtroom reconvened, Judge Whitman returned with a measured expression. She listened as closing statements were delivered, but the decision had already taken shape. It was visible in the set of her jaw, the way she watched Thomas Hale without blinking. She spoke clearly. "This court finds that the evidence supports the defense's account. Mr. Reed intervened in the midst of an ongoing act of abuse." She paused. "Mr. Reed is cleared of criminal intent. The court issues a formal warning regarding the use of physical force, but no conviction will be entered." A collective exhale moved through the room. Judge Whitman continued. "Mr. Hale, the court finds sufficient evidence to refer charges of child abuse and degradation of personhood to the appropriate authorities. You will be taken into custody pending further proceedings." Hale's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Two officers approached. He stood unsteadily, eyes darting. When he was led away, he did not look back. Lena's breath hitched. Tears streamed down her face, not from fear this time, but release. Her knees weakened, and Marcus rose instinctively, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. His touch was brief, respectful. She leaned into it anyway. Reporters surged forward as the room dissolved into motion. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. Marcus stepped aside, letting Lena pass first with Janine. He didn't answer anyone. Outside, the sky had broken open. Sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, bright and unexpected. Lena stopped at the top step and turned. "Thank you," she said. The words were small but complete. Marcus nodded. "You did the brave part." She hesitated, then lifted her injured hand slightly. He mirrored the gesture with a nod. Then she was gone, guided gently into a waiting car. Frank stood nearby, Milo sitting at his feet. Frank cleared his throat. "You did right." Marcus looked out at the city, at faces moving, changing, thinking. "The truth did," he said. As the car doors closed and the crowd thinned, Marcus felt the weight shift, not disappear, but redistribute. The truth had been seen. It could not be buried again. And for the first time since that cold afternoon, the city felt like it might be listening. Spring arrived quietly, the way real change often does. The city shed its gray skin inch by inch, snow melting into gutters, trees pushing small green fists through hard soil, sunlight lingering a little longer on the sidewalks. Months had passed since the courthouse doors closed behind Marcus, and with them, a chapter of noise and judgment. What followed wasn't applause. It was work. Marcus didn't move to a larger apartment. He didn't hire a publicist or accept invitations to speak on stages that wanted his pain more than his purpose. Instead, he sat at a plain wooden table in a borrowed office space above a community center and began assembling something slower, sturdier. He called it the Open Hands Fund. The name mattered to him, not because it sounded noble, but because it described an action rather than an identity. Open hands could give. Open hands could receive. Open hands could not hold on to power too tightly. The fund focused on children of color and people facing discrimination, but it did not exclude anyone. Marcus insisted on that clause, rewriting it himself. Justice that picks sides becomes another kind of wall. He told the small group who helped him. "I don't want walls." One of those people was Nina Alvarez, a woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. Nina was Latina, medium height with a slim build and curly dark hair she kept pulled back in a low bun when she worked. She had grown up translating bills and legal letters for her parents, which made her fiercely protective of people who felt overwhelmed by systems designed to confuse them. Nina handled logistics, budgets, and applications with calm efficiency, challenging Marcus when necessary and supporting him when the work felt endless. Another was Jamal Price, a tall black man in his late 20s with broad shoulders and a quiet demeanor. Jamal had once been a teacher before burnout and bureaucracy pushed him out of the classroom. He believed deeply in second chances and worked with the fund's education programs, tutoring kids after school and helping families navigate enrollment paperwork. Jamal didn't speak much in meetings, but when he did, people listened. They worked out of folding chairs and donated desks. The coffee was bad. The hours were long, and none of it felt heroic. That was the point. Marcus still walked the city, though now people sometimes recognized him. A few nodded in respect. Others watched with the same guarded eyes as before. The world hadn't transformed overnight, but something subtle had shifted. Less resistance in certain places, more curiosity in others. One afternoon, as the light warmed the streets, Marcus stopped by the community center where the fund partnered with local programs. Children's voices echoed from the gym, laughter, sneakers squeaking, a basketball thumping rhythmically. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint sweetness of juice boxes. That was where he saw Lena again. She was sitting at a table near the windows, a book open in front of her. Her hair was longer now, pulled back neatly, and she wore a simple yellow sweater that brightened her face. The bandage was gone from her hand, replaced by faint pink scars that were already fading. She looked older, not hardened, but steadier. Lena looked up and froze for half a second. Then she smiled. It wasn't the cautious smile he remembered. It was open. Real. She stood, a little awkwardly, and walked over. "Hi," she said. Marcus smiled back, soft and genuine. "Hi." She gestured toward the book. "I'm learning fractions. They're annoying." Marcus chuckled quietly. "They get better. Eventually." Lena hesitated, then took a breath. "I start school full-time next week," she said. "They said I might even be able to skip a grade if I keep this up." "That's incredible," Marcus said, and he meant it. She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers. "I wanted to say something. Before I forget how." Marcus waited. "You didn't just save me," Lena said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone. "You showed me that I mattered, that I wasn't just something people could step on." Marcus felt the words land somewhere deep, somewhere that had been tight for a long time. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "You already mattered," he said finally. "I just reminded the world." She smiled again, brighter this time, and returned to her table. Marcus watched her go, the sound of children playing filling the space between them like a promise. Outside, life moved on as it always had. Cars passed, people hurried. Somewhere, someone was still being judged unfairly. Somewhere else, someone was choosing silence over courage. Marcus stood on the steps of the community center and looked at the crowd. He knew prejudice hadn't disappeared. He knew there would be days when his fund struggled, when applications outnumbered resources, when progress felt painfully slow. But he also knew this. Every time someone stood up, the ground shifted just enough to matter. Money had given Marcus access. It had given him tools. But it wasn't money that changed anything in the end. It was choice. It was presence. It was the refusal to look away. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, Marcus turned back inside. There was work to do tomorrow. And the day after that. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door. At the end of this story, the lesson is simple, but not easy. In everyday life, injustice does not always appear as loud violence. Most of the time, it appears as silence, as looking away, as telling ourselves it is not our problem. Marcus did not change the world because he was rich. He changed one life, then another, because he chose to stand when others stayed still. We may never face a moment as dramatic as a courtroom or a public confrontation, but every day we are given smaller choices: to speak up when someone is humiliated, to help without expecting praise, to see people not for their skin, status, or past, but for their humanity. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that courage still exists. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach people who need hope. And if you believe that God watches over those who protect the innocent and speak truth even when it costs them, then take a moment with us now. May God bless you. May He protect your heart, your family, and your path. May He give you the strength to stand when it matters. If you agree, type Amen in the comments.